All right, so we've hit the where. We've talked a little about why, which is an overarching question we're asking ourselves the whole time. Let's talk about what, and specifically what kind of habitat do we want to manage in our waterfowl impoundment. I think you can split it into, well, maybe three categories, but since we're talking about improving, we're only going to talk about two of them, right? One is just a wild area that you don't do anything with. You just show up and hunt, right? Golly, wouldn't that be nice if we all had that? But we're talking about doing some management to improve the habitat to attract more ducks, which is going to have a lot of other benefits for the other wildlife in the area. But specifically, we're looking at attracting more ducks. And like I said, I think we have two broad categories that we can follow to do that. One is moist soil habitat management, and then the second is growing cultivated crops. So let's talk a little bit first about moist soil habitat. All right, so what is moist soil habitat? I know some people will kick that term around, but I've met some that they don't know what they're talking about. I've seen people that they think moist soil is flood it and forget it, and that's not. That might be more like a green tree reservoir, if you've got that. Moist soil habitat is kind of what it says, right? You think of those moist, soggy areas that never kind of dry out. They always stay pretty damp, and maybe they seasonally flood. Right, that's a moist soil, and a key to managing, and it does require actual management. You don't just let it grow wild, because what you're trying to achieve is to hold that land in the early stages of succession. Right, if you've not heard that term used before in this context, what it means is succession is going from like bare landscape, maybe something was cleared or a fire came through or whatever, bare landscape. The early part of the succession is when you get these grasses that make lots of seeds and things like that ducks and other birds like to eat. Later stages, you'll start getting buckbrush like we see here. Maybe some willows will start to pop up, which we have some of those around here as well. And then you'll get more into more woody vegetation, trees, oak trees, that we've got all over the place here. That don't do anything good except make shade. But you'll get those later stages of succession. So what we're trying to do is hold it back in the early stages of succession, okay? So that does require management. You're going to have to keep the woody vegetation out. You may have to come in, maybe not every year, but every couple of years maybe, and trim back this buckbrush. This buckbrush was almost not there at all a year ago, and now it's, waist high. So you're going to have to work on getting things like that out of there. It does require some turning over of the ground. The neat thing about moist soil habitat, and here's definitely a plus to put in the column for moist soil habitat, is that these plants have had millions of years of evolution to help them become specifically adapted to grow in this environment. So they need very little help from us. These seeds will literally stay in the seed bank in the ground for decades and remain viable. What we can do to help them along is come through, well, we can do two things. We can control water, and then we can also disturb the land, right? So controlling the water is very important in this, because when you drain the land is going to have a huge impact on what types of plants grow. And for moist soil habitat, when we want to promote the growth of those really good duck groceries like smartweed and wild millets, things of that nature, we're looking for an early growing season drawdown. Okay, what's an early season drawdown? What's early season? It's actually been well defined by experts who know a lot more about this than I do. That's basically the first 45 days of your growing season, and you define that by what's the average date of your last frost each spring. So for me in North Carolina, I looked it up, and every resource gave me a little bit different number, but I kind of settled on about the second week of April as my average last frost. Some years it'll be earlier, some years it'll be later, but we got to work with the averages here, right? So that's one of the dates to consider for cultivated plants as well, but specifically when you're dealing with moist soil habitat, because whenever that last frost date is, count out 45 days, about a month and a half in the future, and in that window is when you want to be doing your slow drawdown, and that's key. Don't go in one day, pull out all the boards or whatever it is you use to hold water and let it all run away. To really do this properly, you want a slow drawdown, a few inches every week. 1 or 2 inches this week, 1 or 2 inches next week, something like that. And then the last bit of it will maybe even just be from evaporation, because that's the natural process. If you think about what this stuff looks like in the wild, it doesn't suddenly one day lose all the water, right? It will dry up over time. So that's one thing to consider, a slow drawdown in the early growing season, that first 45 days after your average last frost. If you wait later to do this without planting anything or doing anything, then you're going to promote things that are undesirable, things like Sesbania or coffee bean, the really hateful one we all dislike, cockleburr. That will start to grow, and I had some of that growing around the edges last year. But drawing it down later is going to promote those less desirable plants. So an early water drawdown. And then the other thing I mentioned is disturbing the soil. This doesn't need to be done every year. Every 2 or 3 years is fine if you can do it, but if you can get into your spot with a small disc, and as soft as this soil is right now, it wouldn't take much. A small ATV disc behind an ATV that could pull it, and I don't know if mine could through this, is going to be fine. You're just disturbing that soil, popping some of those seeds back up to the top that have been laying there for who knows how long, and giving them a chance to grow. That disturbance is going to help promote, again, those wild millets and the smart weeds and all the positive things that we want. While at the same time, that's detrimental for more of the, what are the perennials, things that continue to grow season to season. Our millets and our things like that are annuals. I never can get this right. They require a seed to drop to grow from next year. But these other things, like woolgrass is one that I've seen in some places that can take over. It's the same plant that keeps coming back every year. That's another way to hold back succession. By disturbing that soil, you're going to prevent some of those less desirable plants from growing. Again, doesn't need to be done every year. 2-3 years, I think, is the typical recommendation. Probably wouldn't hurt anything if you did it every year. Just work you probably don't need to do. And I don't know that for certain. That's just a guess. But those are the things to think about. Moist soil habitat is great. A lot of guys that run big outfits actually prefer it. I'm sure you guys know who Tony Vandemore is. I've had some virtual conversations with him. He did a live stream, and I was able to join that and ask a few questions, and I've seen just what he does. He prefers it in a lot of instances to natural vegetation. I think it can be less effort, particularly with some of the other cultivars that we'll talk about. But it's natural. Oh, another great thing about moist soil habitat, since these are naturalized plants, we're not restricted by baiting laws like we are if we come in here and planted a bunch of corn or rice or millet. As you know, with those baiting laws, if you plant a crop this season, if I plant something this year to hunt over this fall, I cannot manipulate that crop in any way. I can't cut it down, I can't roll it over, I can't burn it. I can harvest it if I wanted to, and then whatever waste seed falls on the ground, but I can't do any manipulation. Wild vegetation is completely free of those restrictions. You can come in here, and since I'm not going to plant here this year, I have enough stuff coming up naturally, I'm going to come in here a couple weeks before it's time to flood, and I'm going to mow this sucker down. That does a lot of great things for you. That distributes the seed, right? So why are we doing that? The why is to distribute the seed around, make it easier for the ducks to get to. And the other one is that when those plant stems form this horizontal substrate, that is a fantastic habitat for all those little crustaceans that grow in this water that the ducks will also target and seek out as well. It's a big part of their diet. Particularly in the fall when they're getting ready for the breeding season, right? So a couple of big advantages there for moist soil. It doesn't, we'll talk about this in a kind of all things together in a little bit. It doesn't maybe produce as much food per acre as a clean cornfield, but I think it's probably easier to grow. And like I said, it frees you up a little bit to distributing that seed and doing some things to bring the ducks in. So I think that's kind of all I can say about moist soil habitat management. It can be useful. Maybe it works for you, maybe not. But that's one more thing. So next, I think, let's talk a little bit about cultivated plants.